Last Pint Productions presents the New Way podcast. The New Way contains adult content, and new episodes are released most Wednesdays. So back off, man. We're professionals. Listener discretion is advised.
So you were in Vietnam, if I'm not mistaken?
Yeah?
Were you in the shit?
Yeah, I was in shit.
Last night, Darth Vader came down from planet Vulcan and told me that if I didn't take Lorraine out, that he'd melt my brain.
Here's how you get him. He pulls a knife, you pull a gun. He sends one of yours to the hospital, you send one of his to the morgue.
We came, we saw, we kicked its ass.
Everybody wants to be naked and famous. Everybody wants to be just like me. I'm naked.
Will you help teach me about this? What is it? A new way?
Hello and welcome to the New Way podcast, where we break down pop culture so you don't have to. I'm your host, Matt Schenk, and we have something a little different in store for you today. Inspired by Rob Harvilla's genius podcast, 60 Songs That Explain the 90s, we've decided to give you a better understanding of the media that inspired us to start this little podcast. We have each picked a couple of pieces of pop culture media, including movies, television, music, theater, and the like, which have had an impact on us. We will discuss these in depth and separate from one another. And we'll finish up each episode interviewing someone who shares our interest in the subject. So, without further ado, this is 6 properties that explain the New Way. "1994 was a bizarre year for film. Not in a bad way or in a particularly strange way, but in a revolutionary way. A cultural shift was happening. It's easy to see that from the safe confines of the future, but as a fresh-faced 15-year-old, I certainly did not recognize what was happening. In the final week of March 1995, I was in a motel room near Biloxi, Mississippi. It was spring break. I was 16 years old and on a road trip with my parents on our way to spend a couple of days in New Orleans. My mother and I turned on the TV in order to watch the 67th Annual Academy Awards, honoring the films of 1994. My dad was not interested in such things and was reading a book, likely a soon-to-be optioned John Grisham novel. It is widely regarded as one of the most stacked years in Academy history. Forrest Gump ran away with 6 awards. It likely would have garnered more if it hadn't also been competing with the likes of a few movies you may have heard of. Pulp Fiction, The Shawshank Redemption, 4 Weddings and a Funeral, Quiz Show, Bullets Over Broadway, The Client, possibly the book my father was reading at that very moment. The Madness of King George, Little Women, one of many Little Women adaptations and definitely not the book my father was reading, Nell, Heavenly Creatures, and even Kieslowski's 3 Colors, the red entry. And, tying into our upcoming road trip destination, Interview with the Vampire was up for an Oscar, albeit for Best Original Score. If those were the only films to come out in 1994, you might say that it was a normal mix of large spectacle films, art house favorites, and new indie darlings. But that would be painting a very incomplete picture of what else was happening in 1994. This is a year that brought us 3 of the decade's top comedies, all starring a comedian best known prior to that year as the white guy from In Living Color. That's right. Ace Ventura, Pet Detective, came out February 4th, 1994, followed by The Mask on July 29th, and a little sleeper comedy called Dumb and Dumber on December 16th. That was a week after Barry Levinson's adaptation of Michael Crichton's Disclosure was released, which, incidentally, could have also been the book my father was reading. I could devote this entire episode to the insanity of a movie year that brought us both Cabin Boy and Airheads, alongside True Lies and Speed, alongside Eat, Drink, Man, Woman, and Adventures of Priscilla, Queen of the Desert, but something else happened in 1994, something that would have a far greater impact on me, and which perhaps was a harbinger, maybe good, maybe bad, of what we are seeing in terms of content in 2022. The breakout independent movie of 1994 was Pulp Fiction. It was the film that garnered the most attention from the public, from the critics, from absolutely everyone. We discussed it in my sophomore literature class. It made Quentin Tarantino a rock star. In fact, it ushered in the era of director as rock star. More importantly, it ushered in the era of writer-director as rock star. But while Quentin was unknowingly making John Travolta a hot commodity almost 20 years after he was originally a hot commodity, something was happening in a little area of New Jersey called Red Bank. Kevin Patrick Smith was born on August 2nd, 1970, in Red Bank, New Jersey. As legend has it, on his 21st birthday, he saw Richard Linklater's feature debut, Slackers. Now, I will let it be known I have only watched Slackers once, and I found it unwatchable. If I'm truly being honest, I might not ever have even finished it. I've said I'll revisit it, but that is probably a lie. I am a fan of Linklater's. We have devoted an entire episode of this podcast to the man, but this movie is an acquired taste. It's an acquired taste like waterboarding is an acquired taste, but it's an important piece of the independent film movement. Let's leave Red Bank, New Jersey for another moment and talk about what was happening in film in the early 90s. We were on the cusp of the CGI revolution. Terminator 2 rocked our worlds, and a book my father definitely read, because he gave it to me when he had finished it, was being adapted into a film created by master filmmaker Steven Spielberg. That film, 1993's Jurassic Park, would mark a milestone in cinema and remove limitations that had theoretically held filmmakers back since the invention of picture and sound. But there was another shift happening at this time. The independent film movement. It was moving out of the art house and into the mainstream. Spike Lee was making waves with hard-hitting films examining race relations. Michael Moore had begun his path of polarizing and eye-opening documentaries. Steven Soderbergh, the Coen brothers, Robert Rodriguez, Jim Jarmusch, and of course, Quentin Tarantino. But what all of those filmmakers had, Kevin Smith seemed to lack. Smith used these filmmakers as his unofficial film school, even as he attended the actual Vancouver Film School for a mere 4 months. Linklater especially had lit a fire under the young filmmaker. If this guy could just film slice-of-life, low-budget content in his hometown of Austin, Texas, what was stopping Smith from doing the same? Spike Lee's Do the Right Thing provided the backdrop of telling a story that followed the day in the life of a protagonist. And it was this crucial moment in time that Smith found himself working as a convenience store clerk in the unincorporated community of Leonardo, New Jersey. Smith had his concept. He had a small crew comprised of friends he made during his brief stint in film school, and he had a prized comic book collection. A collection worth approximately $27,575, which he would sell in order to fund his vision of the 1994 film Clerks. $27,575. Jurassic Park was currently breaking records on a budget of $63 million. Quentin Tarantino was shooting Pulp Fiction for $8.5 million. Kevin Smith used an expired student ID to rent film equipment on the sly with his student discount when he wasn't even a student. He shot in his current place of employment on black and white film stock at night when the store was closed, hence a running gag of the shutters being gummed shut to cover up the fact that sunlight was not present despite the film taking place largely during the day. Let's get this out of the way. Clerks is a visually unimpressive film. No one is ever going to praise Kevin Smith for his visual storytelling. The camera is static. The characters move in and out of frame and talk. And talk. And talk some more. Boy, do they talk. The plot, okay, there's not really a plot to speak of. Dante and Randall work at side-by-side stores. Dante in a convenience store, Randall in a video store. Dante is a mopey sad sack who constantly reminds us I'm not even supposed to be here today. Randall is a malcontent who loves to hate his customers. They talk about sex, graphically. They talk about Star Wars, graphically. A customer has sex with a dead guy in the bathroom, not graphically, until we see the aftermath. There are dick jokes by the barrelful. Yet Clerks never feels entirely like a frat boy flick. First, the dialogue is so stylized and rapid fire that it feels much more like watching a David Mamet play. A David Mamet play that ends with a dead body sporting a rigamortized penis. Clerks didn't feel like Porky's. It felt more like Eric Bogosian's play, Suburbia, which, incidentally, would later be adapted by none other than Richard Linklater. The plot was Seinfeldian in its joy of being about nothing. These were simply 20 and 30-something slackers going about their day. The movie cost nothing, and it certainly doesn't look expensive. But unlike Slackers, it looked like a film. At least to me. Another confession. I have a storied history with Kevin Smith. In 1995, I auditioned for my school's production of Bye Bye Birdie. I had taken voice lessons the previous year. I had put in the work. This was going to be my show. And then a ringer transferred to our school, a ringer who would go on not only to have a standing gig at the Paris Opera House, but also be listed in People magazine's 50 most eligible bachelors. Fate had it out for me, and on a Saturday afternoon, I was about to head to my local Blockbuster, where I would soon have my first job, to find something to watch. I stopped past my brother's room on my way. He was freshly home from college and often would have rented something weird and interesting and not on my radar. On this day, it was Clerks. So I popped it in my VCR on my little 19-inch TV in my bedroom and I pressed play. I wasn't immediately hooked, and then the phone rang. It was the director. I was not being cast as Albert Peterson, the lead in Bye Bye Birdie, played on stage and screen by Dick Van Dyke. I was being cast as Mr. McAfee, a role originated by podcast favorite Paul Lynde. To quote the Three Amigos, I was crushed. I made some lunch and tried to return to the movie, but I couldn't do it, and there it stayed for quite some time. Smith's second film, Mallrats, came out the following year. My friend and I were going to see it, but opted instead, I think, to watch Cindy Crawford's topless scene in Fair Game. Eventually, I watched Mallrats on my college dorm room movie channel, but I wasn't a Kevin Smith acolyte yet. However, when I finally saw Chasing Amy, that all changed. Chasing Amy was Kevin Smith finally delivering on the promise of Clerks. That said, Mallrats is hysterical. While it was critically panned, it is a solid 90s comedy and easily as good as the Adam Sandler properties that were breaking numbers at the box office. However, it bombed, and Smith, licking his wounds, went back to the well of writing what he knew. He wrote a personal story about a man in love with a woman who was a bit more than he is emotionally able to handle at the time. It was Clerks with real, lived-in characters and heart. It made a star out of Ben Affleck. It gave Jason Lee the meatiest role of his career. It paved the way for Good Will Hunting. And it did so a mere 3 years after Kevin Smith set up a camera in the Quick Stop Groceries convenience store to watch a day in the life of some true slackers. When I finally revisited Clerks, after having worked my senior year at my local Blockbuster, After being introduced to films like Suburbia, The Opposite of Sex, Dazed and Confused, Boogie Nights, Saving Private Ryan, my unofficial film school indoctrination via movies that made me think about more than just the surface level, I had a newfound appreciation for what I was watching. This was a guy like me who wrote about his day-to-day life with rapid-fire dialogue and dick jokes and made an actual movie. A movie that showed in theaters. A movie that allowed him to get bigger budgets. A movie that allowed him to work with and cast future stars like Ben Affleck and Matt Damon. A movie built from a script and not from studying cinematography and shot design and the 180-degree rule. I've always considered the two films that made me a true film geek and which inspired me to learn more about film and even dabble in writing are Clerks and Saving Private Ryan. These films have zero overlap, but they taught me two important lessons. Saving Private Ryan showed me the power of film in allowing us to experience moments in history we had only read about countless times but couldn't really understand. Clerks showed me that movies weren't just for these big moments, and that anyone could make a movie. Maybe even me. How many future filmmakers got into movies because of the likes of Steven Spielberg? A lot. But I imagine there were also a lot who watched that little black and white film and thought, movies are for all of us. For any of us. So, why not take a chance? I'm joined today by executive news producer Chris Schenk. In addition to a lengthy career at the ABC News affiliate in Miami, he is also my brother. Welcome, Chris.
Hi, thanks.
It's kind of interesting. We've talked a lot on the podcast about growing up. I, as you being my elder brother, I get a lot of my pop culture sensibilities from things that you were interested in, or that I most likely just stole from your room when you were back at the house after college. And we're 7 years apart, so there was kind of, you were renting and seeing a lot more fringe things than I was maybe getting and stuff. So I kind of want to know, what was your introduction to what we know today as kind of independent film?
I mean, in college, we were, beginning that sort of phase in film, and I had a guy I worked with at a radio station that sat me down one night and showed me El Mariachi by Robert Rodriguez, and it was like I grew up on Spielberg blockbusters, and my college years were Cameron Terminator and True Lies. Although True Lies is a little bit after that, but I watched this movie, and the editing was like nothing I'd ever seen, and it looked dirty, it looked gritty. And I had some other friends that were more cinephiles than I was, and I was writing for a newspaper before that and doing film reviews, but stuff like Home Alone. I mean, I reviewed singles, quite a array. I had The Hero, that Dustin Hoffman movie.
Oh, wow, with Andy Garcia, yeah.
I began to talk more with my friends, and that was kind of the genesis of not just watching films, but discussing and seeking out different stuff, which then eventually led me to Slacker.
Oh yeah,
which I didn't like it. I still don't like it.
I am 100% with you on that one.
I mean, I like Linklater, but not. I barely got through it in 1993, sitting in my friend's apartment. So, that's where it started.
Yeah. Oh, and Slacker is funny because when I went on my kind of Kevin Smith obsession of stuff, I got into that as well. And I had in the same way, I got to it late. I probably watched it in 2000. So especially by then, that movie felt just ancient and terrible and weird in a way that I wasn't on board with.
Well, to say that, I mean, El Mariachi opened my eyes. Slacker opened my eyes. In the 90s, I was hanging with what would be now described like a grunge group, but I was the preppy guy. I didn't change my aesthetic in college, and I never really would have looked good in Doc Martens and torn jeans and flannels. I mean, I had bright colored polos and spiky hair and Guess jeans and Bucks for shoes, and yeah. So I was watching these movies and was interested in them, but my aesthetic was still big Hollywood blockbusters. That's what I grew up on, and that's what I thought those were good movies.
Well, and you kind of have the genesis of that of your love of Michael Bay with something like Bad Boys, which is like the independent version of Michael Bay for that time, pretty much.
I like Michael Bay from the moment when I saw Bad Boys. And
94.
It was 95. I just started working in TV news.
Well, and it's funny. So we're, obviously we were talking about Clerks a lot on this episode, but 94, the same time that Clerks is shooting, right, also shooting at that same time is Pulp Fiction. So you have really the two sides of the independent film coin at that time. You've got someone that is all visual storytelling and style and
I've got
things.
a good Pulp Fiction story.
Let's hear it.
So 1994, fall of 94, my final semester, I had to take one more semester. I was going to graduate in December, and I'm job hunting. And by job hunting, I would just drive to TV stations in the greater Indiana area. And I wound up spending 2 days in Louisville, Kentucky, which I was familiar with from my mom's horses. And so I was just visiting TV stations and just kind of like throwing my resume at people. And I had some time to kill before I was going to have dinner with an old friend. And I went to a movie theater, and I walked into Pulp Fiction 25 minutes into it. It was possibly the most confusing film experience I've ever had. Excuse me. I subsequently went and watched it from the beginning.
Yes.
I said, okay, now I get it.
What's funny is I had a similarly strange experience watching Pulp Fiction with my friends Mark and Casey. We went, and somewhere around the, I'd say about the 3/4 mark of the movie, the film reel burned up. And we all thought it was part of the movie. So we're sitting there like, wow, this guy is like really balls out. The screen just burned up and it was white. And then they had to restitch. This is back in the days of pure film. They had to restitch the thing back together.
No joke. That happened to me in Apollo 13 as the rocket was taking off. I'm not even kidding. Palm Beach Gardens.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah, those Palm Beach theaters not so good at keeping the film going. So in terms of Kevin Smith and Clerks, when did he kind of come on your radar as far as knowing who Kevin Smith was?
I mean, the guys that I was hanging out with that were watching the more indie stuff. When did Clerks come out?
It's in 90. Both Clerks and Pulp Fiction came out in 94.
So I just turned 50. My memory's foggy. I thought I saw Clerks in college, but obviously I didn't because I was out of college. I didn't see it in the theater. I know that I saw it. I think that it was on the radar. I saw Pulp Fiction, like I said, finally saw the whole thing in the fall of 94. And that really was like, I'm like, okay, this doesn't look like crap. Not that Rodriguez did a good job, but he shoots in the camera. He shoots for the edit.
He's not a great editor. if you've seen Boba Fett, Book of Boba Fett, you know this.
I'm saying, but he never had to edit before. He would just shoot what he wanted in the camera and then just stitch it together. So Pulp Fiction, though, like, this is a real movie and it's really crazy. I've never seen. I mean, I'm not a film buff from the old days, so I've not seen these out of sync stories. You know, so that was like, oh, this is really, really cool. So I guess maybe in probably 95 when I was working at Burdines before I got my first job in TV. Clerks probably came across somewhere on VHS and people were talking about it and someone probably said to see it. That's another one that at that time, I was like, this is just weird.
Yeah.
This is a lot of talking.
Yeah, in that I remember, my introduction to Clerks was, I had auditioned for a show at Benjamin and I didn't get the role that I wanted, and I had just rented Clerks and I tried to watch it that day, which was not a good idea. And it's jarring at that time because you're essentially watching Kevin Smith writes plays that are done sort of on film, barely a visual medium aspect to them.
I mean, if I stitch it together, this may be true that I may have seen Mallrats before I saw Clerks, and because you would talk about Mallrats all the time, and I'm like, this movie looks stupid. And then I watched it and I loved it, and then I think maybe I went back and saw Clerks, which is a weird way to progress through his movies for the first time.
That's very similar to how I think I believe I told someone I had seen Chasing Amy, but I hadn't, and then I watched Chasing Amy and worked my way backwards through his filmography.
My whole introduction to Kevin Smith is solely through you, so I may have done that progression too. I do remember seeing Chasing Amy and think, okay, this is a good movie. It may be his best movie.
Yeah, I mean, it's I would say so.
when I say best movie, I'm in air quotes here. Like it's like Jack Horner in Boogie Nights, where the guy says it's a real film, Jack.
Well, yeah, I think he bragged about having like actually using dolly track in it instead of just setting a camera on two people on a screen.
Well, and it's a story.
Sure.
It's not just a bunch of dick and fart jokes, you know, and
which he draws attention to meta
of
ways.
course.
And it's
There's
interesting.
nothing wrong with that.
No, and he was doing meta commentary on things well before that was kind of popularized with, I would say, maybe Scream probably being the biggest popularity version of that. On one of our recent podcasts, we talked about movie soundtracks and obviously things like Singles, which you mentioned having reviewed, Reality Bites come up. But Clerks has a crazy good soundtrack.
Does it? I've never really looked into it.
There's I remember distinctly the Clerks trailer has the two things that are interesting on it. One is that it's got like whatever, like if it was Slam Dance, I think the festival that it made, so it's got that on it. But then it was back when they used to boast soundtracks on trailers, and it would say at the end of the trailer with music by, it was like Alice in Chains, Supernova, Bad Religion, Stabbing Westward, which is amazing.
Stabbing Nine Inch Nails.
Yes, Soul Asylum, but Soul Asylum had the big song off of it, and then Alice in Chains. Those were the two on there. Do you think, or do you feel, and maybe I'm leading the question a bit with this, but do you feel that there's a correlation with that indies boom in the 90s and kind of the alternative rock scene in
for
the
sure.
90s?
That's what I'm saying. I mean, I was, like I said, I was a grunge guy in polo clothing. You know, I never changed my aesthetic, but I totally got on with that crowd. I identified with them. I worked at an alternative music station, and for sure, the guy who taught me a lot about alternative music is Buzz Fitzgerald. He subsequently was the one who showed me El Mariachi and showed me other stuff. And for sure, the music scene, indie music scene, as indie as it is, and the indie movie scene definitely came up for me at least.
Kind of side by side. We've seen a fair amount of Kevin Smith movies together, including his original movies that we probably rented and watched together. Do you have a favorite in the Kevin Smith kind of oeuvre?
Well, like I said, I think Chasing Amy is the most complete narrative. I mean, and it's got some emotion to it. It's got some heft to it.
Best Affleck performance.
Dude, I'm a sucker for Jay and Silent Bob. I mean,
it is
Boo
pretty
Boo Kitty
great.
Fuck. You know, just speaking of soundtracks, the score to that movie is just crazy.
Yeah,
you know, it's
James Venable.
Yeah, it's all just so cartoonish. And
yes,
and it's a comic book movie, and obviously he's a comic book guy. I don't think I really realized it, but it's his comic book superhero movie.
It's almost actually his comic strip.
Well,
like it's very cartoony.
And talk about meta. I mean,
Oh yeah.
Gus Van Sant.
Jesus, Ben, I'm busy. It's funny because I think you and I have a very similar thing with Smith, because Jay and Silent Bob is another one of those movies. I saw that at the Chicago Wizard Con with Dad.
That's a mistake.
Like a sneak preview of it.
You watched it with him?
I did not watch it. He dropped me. He had no interest in going to that, but he dropped me, and I saw it in. The crowd wasn't quite on it, and I hated it. I thought it was dumb. It was unfunny. I came out of it going, there's a 15-minite fart joke with Ali Larder. I was so upset. And then a week later, I saw it with my friends, and I'm like, this is great. And I think Kevin Smith, there's something about the first time you watch certain things he does, you're not ready for where he's going with it. And then once you get on board,
know if you remember, you and I and my ex-wife and my friend Michael
Clerks
and his
too.
then girlfriend Zach and Miri.
Oh yeah,
in a tiny auditorium in Aventura, but it was that is just basically us in the back row of one of these, one of those where they park a Kevin Smith movie, like 40 seats and looks like a big screen TV. But it was fun with you and with Giselle, because she's into that stuff, and with Michael and Michael's girlfriend at the time didn't understand what the hell was going on, but it was just that watching that by itself, it's okay, But his movies definitely.
How you watch
benefit
his
from
movies,
some chemical intervention and the people you see it with.
I 100% agree with that. I want to thank you so much for your time on this. This podcast has been very I know you were surprised that I brought you on and didn't bring you on to talk about Michael Bay, but
Yeah.
it is funny.
We'd be here a lot longer than 12 minutes.
Well, what's funny is I said to Chris before this podcast that I would just steal whatever movies he was renting from Blockbuster out of his room and watch them. I didn't understand.
Which is problematic now that I think back about some of the stuff I was getting from Blockbuster.
But then there were things like you had like the Red, White, and Blue trilogy, the Before Sunset movies. Like there were movies that I was not.
I didn't know what the hell I was watching at the time.
I didn't get them either, but I mean, I would grab them and watch. I watched Suburbia, which of all the things that you rented that I really responded to, Suburbia was probably the biggest one for me, and a much better link ladder for me than Slacker for sure. But thank you so much for joining us, and thank you. We'll do one of these again.
All right, thanks guys.
We want to thank our guest, Chris Schenk, for his participation in this little experiment of ours. We will return to our regularly scheduled programming next episode. Until then, this has been 6 Properties That Explain the New Way. Cheers.